It might feel weird, but Fall Guys released over a year ago now. Dropping onto PS Plus as a free monthly download in August 2020, it was an absolutely massive success. Which is why it's so strange that as quickly as it rose to the heights of pop culture sensation, that pedestal vanished. Which is a real shame, because arguably the most exciting to play and visually varied stages released in post-launch updates. Playing it now is a significantly different experience than it was at the start, and after over a year of improvement, iterating on what works and tossing out what doesn't, for the most part, Mediatonic has come out with Season 5. I originally wanted to critique it in its entirety, but while the new rounds may blend together at first glance, one particular stage utilizes an interesting new approach to Fall Guys level design. Treetop Tumble demands a much more thorough examination into how it succeeds, in addition to its many shortcomings. Race courses can typically be divided into parts based on where their checkpoints are located, with Treetop Tumble having 6 of them. But it's not quite that simple here. This stage also necessitates another type of grouping of those individual parts into 3 sections, since the revamp significantly increased the complexity of the structure. Treetop Tumble starts with a line of spinning platforms on top of a slime ramp, a lily pad course on top of a froggy marsh, a slide on top of a field with bumpers, and you may have started to notice a trend. Aside from the very end, every challenge in this level has an upper and lower layer. Treetop Tumble isn't about exploring one mechanic in particular, it takes advantage of a structural level gimmick involving multiple paths to introduce many of the season's new mechanics. It's not a revolutionary idea to have riskier sections that let more skilled players get across faster, while providing an easier option for newer ones. It keeps the layout more varied and interesting, and adds a depth from having a risk-reward trade-off. Not to mention the increased accessibility that comes from allowing courses to appeal to a variety of skill levels, which is why they're often used in earlier stages, many of which have a divergence at some point that completely separates the level before it eventually comes together. Again, this is pretty standard affair. However, Mediatonic have also flirted in the past with meshing multiple routes together, rather than completely separating them. In Dizzy Heights and Hit Parade, there's a longer and less difficult route, but 99% of players aren't going to use it until falling off of the main one, so it's less of an alternate option and more of a punishment for failure. The best parts of Treetop Tumble end up looking much closer to a stage like Tundra Run than either of these. In that stage, after ascending the opening stairs, there's a half-pipe structure resting above a pit, which might seem like it follows the same principle as earlier, but the cutout space on the side silently communicates that these are both valid options. The upper route increases its difficulty by adding icy surfaces to the already present challenge of avoiding punching boxes. Thanks to verticality, players who take the riskier path can continue on the easier one if they fall, encouraging aggressive play in both newer players getting used to more difficult obstacles, and veterans experimenting with new methods to save time, but still keeping the easy option available. This part's particular risk-reward trade-off for taking the harder route isn't very worth it, but it was a good first attempt at using subtle differences to have unique routes in which you can fall from one to the other while also presenting them both as legitimate choices. Now that it's been over a year, we've finally gotten a more fleshed out version of this concept. Save for the end, when Treetop Tumble diverges, it stays separate from multiple parts, and doesn't immediately reconnect at the next checkpoint, so there have to be upper and lower checkpoints for each group between the connection points. These longer divergences that group multiple parts together can be classified as their own sections, with the first 3 parts making up Section 1, the 4th and 5th parts comprising the second section, and the final section leading immediately into the finish as just one part all by itself. However, due to some of the difficulties of developing stages with this structure, the second section arguably reverts back to something closer to what Dizzy Heights and Hit Parade did, but significantly less interesting and even a little broken if you take the lower route. But we'll cross that bridge when we get there. We've still got to jump into the first section, beginning with the option to take on 3 rotating platforms with frog balloons that periodically inflate and deflate, taking up quite a bit of space, or a slide covered in glue with spinning hammers. Neither of these are super difficult by themselves, but that's intentional to compensate for the massive players that will inevitably bump into you as you try to get ahead. Otherwise, the lower route would be nearly obsolete, but the organic hazard posed by your competitors makes the open space below pretty inviting compared to the claustrophobic scramble happening above. The hammers might mess you up, but they're usually just a small inconvenience and can even push you forward occasionally. After the first checkpoint, if you manage to stay on top, you'll be navigating a floating array of lily pads that bounce you into the sky once you land on them. It's faster to get as much horizontal momentum as possible to reach the end using fewer bounces, but this method requires a pretty good amount of skill with the mechanic. Most players will start out by conservatively moving from platform to platform on the outer edge, potentially bouncing on the same lily pad twice or even a few times, especially if they haven't been to Lily Leapers yet and this is a new obstacle for them. But once you know what you're doing, you can use some tactical diving or these smaller, more difficult to land on pads to fly across the middle and get to the front of the pack. If you misjudge a bounce or slid down the goo at the beginning, you'll instead be navigating a pool of water with some solid platforms. But they'll be a bit riskier than simply wading your way through the water, since you can't be on them for too long without a frog balloon exploding and knocking you to the ground. If you want to speed up a bit, you can use the rotating platforms on the sides or even try to propel yourself forward when one of the frog balloons inflates if you're feeling particularly bold. Once again, the area below is pretty open and easy to navigate, whereas you're much more likely to get knocked around if you take the high road. But even outside of that initial divide, there are plenty more smaller decisions to make that keep the experience varied and interesting, long after the initial excitement of trying out a stage has faded. Players who've remained on the upper route through both parts are rewarded by getting to sit back, relax. Oh my god, what was that voice crack? Jeez. Oh my gosh! Woo! Players who've remained on the upper route through both parts are rewarded by getting to sit back, relax, and ride down a goose slide, while everybody else is dealing with a ring of bumpers rotating in opposite directions that were honestly a bit more difficult to get past than I originally expected. It's certainly a ramp up and challenge from the previous two parts, but that only serves to further heighten the reward of skipping over it, as you're probably going to be well ahead of the other players at this point. This is also the end of the first section, as the two routes reconverge at a single checkpoint, and if it's your first time through, that'll be your introduction to 3 obstacles and mechanics new to Season 5, expanding frogs, watery surfaces, and lily pads, all of which get used to some extent later on, with the lily pads being the season's biggest new innovation. As such, I find it odd that the level structure subtly funnels players so that they'll have to interact with the frogs early on in the level no matter which route they pick. This would have been much more appropriate and necessary for the lily pads, which get used more often in the season as a whole and are less easily intuitive. The biggest new addition of the season is fairly out of the way in its flagship stage. If they had done something similar to what they did with the frog, putting lily pads in both routes, it would have more aptly prepared players for Lily Leapers, which is almost entirely about bouncing on lily pads, rather than throwing them in at the deep end. Meanwhile, the frogs could have been given less attention and taken more of a backseat with little to no consequence, which is exactly what they did with the inclusion of watery surfaces. Wading in water takes all of 2 seconds to pick up. If you mess up, you might fall into some water and find yourself walking slower. That's just about it. There's not as much of a need for it to be carefully introduced, so they didn't waste space on it. The second section exposes players to new mechanics more appropriately, but the context in which they find themselves and the actual mechanics being introduced, everything else about the section, is a bit more questionable. After the checkpoint connecting both halves of the first section together, it begins with a pretty spacious track covered in water, below a more narrow one that sees you dodging bumpers rotating on the outer edge of a wheel once again, but this time they're moving vertically rather than horizontally. In order to get past, you have to judge what the position of the bumper will be by the time you reach it. If it's on the ground, you'll have to jump over it, but when it's higher up, all you have to do is walk right through. Or, if you've got a giant goose head such as myself, break your spine trying. Positioned between the goose murder machines is a row of inflating frogs that you can either zigzag around, or walk past if you've got the timing down and can avoid getting blasted. These won't pose much of a challenge, unless you decide to skip the spinning bumpers and try your luck on these cylinder platforms, which have rotating fans with small openings and end or begin right when there's an inflatable frog. I consider this the most perilous and difficult part of the entire round. There's an incredibly thin area to stand on that can have other players, and utilizes multiple precise timing windows. Not to mention, if you get hit by one of the fans, you're almost certainly falling to the ground, whereas the bumper is a lot more generous. Considering how little time there is to be saved here, all of this adds up to make the risk-reward trade-off feel completely broken, even more so than the icy section of Tundra Run back in Season 3. I don't see any good reason to voluntarily use this path, which could also be said of the bottom route. Save for the brief moments of jumping on a lily pad or needing to dodge a cannonball, it's just wading through water, which is both too slow to be a viable option, especially considering how low risk the main path is, and more importantly lacks engaging decisions to make. As a result, if I made a stupid mistake and fell off right at the beginning into the water, I'd just jump off the edge and respawn back at the checkpoint up top. Which is where I also have to call this section's structure into question. Because if we're at the point where players are deliberately triggering a fail state in order to avoid a piece of content, something's probably gone wrong. In the opening of Treetop Tumble, both routes were clearly framed as alternate options by letting the player walk onto either without making a mistake. While you could fall onto the goo slide, it was also possible to just stroll right up to it. The second section, on the other hand, requires you to fall off a ledge in order to reach the bottom, which frames it as a punishment for failure. You could argue that the horizontal space on the right signifies both as viable options, like with Tundra Run, but the otherwise unnecessary wedge before the narrow path on the left, which has a much neater visual style compared to the sudden cutoff on the right, signifies that this is likely the intended path, and the vast majority of players seem to follow suit. It's more similar to the previously mentioned parts of Dizzy Heights and Hit Parade than anything Tundra Run did, really. Those stages would theoretically have the player respawn up at the top as well, but they were completely walled off, making it impossible to do so. Forgoing that provision here feels like a strange oversight, which created the exploit of dying to get back up to the checkpoint on top. You don't need me to tell you that I prefer the innovative structural change of the first half, but that might not have worked very well with these particular obstacles. The lower part isn't very full of things to do, and mostly consists of walking while occasionally dodging balls or rhinos. It feels underdeveloped in comparison to the rest of the level, which probably came as a result of the downside of developing this kind of level structure. Packing so much into one stage takes a lot more time and resources to develop, and I suspect that the change in structure was decided on as a band-aid when they realized that they wouldn't be able to flesh out the bottom path for the scheduled release date, which most likely made the stage better than if they hadn't done anything about it. If I'm right about this being a band-aid solution though, then that's probably where the checkpoint abuse exploit came from as well, as there wouldn't have been any problem had both routes been legitimate options. It would have felt like picking a different path for your second attempt, rather than teleporting yourself back to the better one in a way that never doesn't feel like cheating. I'm not going to blame the developers for this though, because these sorts of deadlines are often the result of a push for profit by corporate executives, rather than by those making the creative decisions. Unless you work for Mediatonic or know somebody who does, it's not our place to come to conclusions on the matter of who's at fault. I'd like to make it clear that I still really like this level. It has a lot of problems, but that was inevitable considering how experimental it is compared to every other stage. I generally have more to say about negative aspects of games than positive ones, make of that what you will, so the ratio of time spent speaking positively to negatively might seem out of balance if you're approaching this from the mindset that that ratio should represent my overall opinion. Anyway, what's up next? Oh yeah, 60 Fall Guys, 2 swinging logs, and a rhino with an anger management issue. If you fall at any point in this section, you'll have to navigate a flat open arena with 2 rhinos running around and charging at people. Of the times when I got hit, most of them didn't feel fair. There just wasn't much I could do to avoid them, either because of multiple attacks overlapping, other players, the pure speed of their charge, or a combination of factors. They telegraph when they're going to attack, so it was still pretty easy to avoid them the rest of the time. However, I'm willing to bet that my experience in the Souls games with battling multiple enemies by panning the camera and evading attacks when I see a telegraph probably helped, so I wouldn't be surprised if it proved more difficult for others, and that they died in a way that was more often their own fault. That's also this video's obligatory mention of Dark Souls. You're welcome. You didn't put Dark Souls in the Sonic Mania video. Oh, yeah, you're right. No! Once you get across, the checkpoint is just a short ride up away. Meanwhile, the players on the top will be jumping across 2 giant logs tied to rope swings which move back and forth. There's not much going on here, but this is the end of the section, so just like the slide at the end of the first one, it deliberately rewards players for staying on top. This one isn't as easy as the Goose Slide, but it's also part of a shorter section, so the reward is proportional. Players might not notice it at first, but there are subtle ways of shaving time by jumping onto the next platform as soon as possible, rather than waiting for it to slow down while switching directions. My only nitpick is that the ropes have collision, which can make crossing awkward when they're positioned diagonally. I wouldn't be surprised if a significant number of players didn't expect this their first time and got knocked off as a result like I did, since these types of supports are pretty commonly treated as ghost objects that you can walk through in most games. They also could have just changed the visual design to better indicate that the ropes are solid. This could be a result of the band-aid fix this section was given, and there just wasn't enough time for more testing. We'll never really know. Both routes center around an entirely new mechanic that gets expanded on in later stages. The log swings prepare players for bubble trouble, where they'll have to collect 15 bubbles before everyone else, some of which are floating in midair on a section with another log swing. The rhinos also get used on later in Stompin' Ground, which could either be a good thing or a very bad thing depending on what came first. If this route was created as a way to get players used to the new mechanics before Stompin' Ground, then that's totally fine. But if they decided to build on the already somewhat uncompelling mechanic of the rhinos in a dedicated stage afterwards, then it was one of the worst decisions made during the development of this entire season. Stompin' Ground is everything I complained about here taken to the max, in addition to a much stronger penalty for death, and the glaring oversight that lily pads, which are supposed to protect you from getting knocked out, can block your line of sight to the rhinos. It's tied for the worst stage added to Fall Guys since its release, along with Big Shots, and I groaned about it every single time it showed up. I hate this stage so much that I still found a way to complain about it in a video that's just supposed to be about Treetop Tumble. Speaking of which, we should probably get back to the topic at hand. The final act of Treetop Tumble is just ahead, and it's the shortest one yet. While not using the god-awful approach of the second, the third section also doesn't revert back to the style of the first one, which is understandable due to its size, instead utilizing the traditional structure for divergent paths of having them completely separated, while mixing in the vertical one pioneered by the first section just a tiny bit. The standard option is to ride one of the goose slides, walk across the spinning platform while avoiding the bumpers moving around on the edge, and ride the slide to the finish. However, if you're confident at using the lily pads, you can utilize 2 of them to leapfrog over everything in front of you. That by itself could be a bit too easy for the significant time save, so you've also got to contend with one of the inflatable frogs resting right smack in the middle of your trajectory. This stage has already had its more advanced players deal with jumping across lily pads and judging whether it's safe to be near an inflatable frog at any given time, but this combines both challenges together. It requires getting a large amount of distance, judging how long it'll take to get across, and knowing whether the frogs will send you flying along the way. The 2 routes are mostly separated, and then if you mess up, you're probably going to fall into the void, but it is also possible to end up on the rotating platform in the middle, or even on one of the goose slides, so players might have to unexpectedly change their strategy on the fly. It's not a spectacular finish, but reusing a bunch of the stage's ideas to create something that can be easy if you want it to be, or incredibly rewarding and quick if you put the effort in, is a nice way to cap off what Treetop Tumble was trying to be, even if it didn't truly capture the innovative and unique structural changes made by the first section. From the fantastic opening to the lackluster follow-up, and capping off with an ending that was in some ways a callback to the start, but didn't quite capture its unique framework, this entire stage was a bold experiment. And while Mediatonic's marketing department might have referred to Lost Temple as their most ambitious round yet, I think the more subtle but no less groundbreaking changes that Treetop Tumble makes to the Fall Guys formula have a lot of potential, and I hope to see them further iterated on in more mid-season updates or the eventual Season 6, which, judging by the size of the script I've written, will probably be out by the time I finish this. Hopefully we'll see something that refines the concept, but it's always possible that nothing ever comes of it. Maybe because of the increased development cost and scope, maybe because it wasn't considered a success inside the company, or for any other reasons. Regardless, Treetop Tumble will always be a special part of Fall Guys history to me, whether that's because it's a unique one-off in the game's history, or due to its role as a catalyst for a continuing level design philosophy, only time will tell.